This program has been approved for one IDCEC CEU. To receive credit for this program, please submit your full name, IDCEC number, program class code, and your summary essay to ceu@iida.org. The program class code is located alongside the title of this program on the IIDA Academy page. For a certificate of completion to use toward another certifying body, please submit the same information to ceu@iida.org. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Collective Design Season 4, Episode 2, The Future of Living Equitably. Today's Collective Design is moderated by Jason Pugh, Principal and Global Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Gensler. And we have an amazing panel today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Yasmin. Really excited to be here today. And welcome to the Future of Living Equitably. Really excited for the discussion and the panel today. I actually know all three panelists in very unique, different ways. Here with us today, we have Monica Chadha, founder, principal architect of Civic Projects Architecture here in Chicago. She leads all aspects of projects in the office and serves as the primary point of contact on most of her projects with clients. Prior to starting her own firm, she served as the founding director of Impact Detroit and led project teams at both Studio Gang and Ross Barney Architects. Welcome, Monica. Good to see you. We also have with us Terry Guen, principal and founder of Terry Guen Design Associates, also here in Chicago. Terry was the Millennium Park Master Landscape Architect and is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Her 30-year career spans complex ecological planning, design, and construction of public urban landscapes in the Midwest and East Coast. Terry, good to see you as well. Welcome. And last but not least, Yiselle Santos Rivera, Principal, Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at HKS. Yiselle Santos is a medical planner, Principal and Global Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at HKS's DC office. She thrives on building equitable practices, empowering the next generation of leaders, and creating inclusive platforms for engagement. Welcome. Good to see you all.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
So I'm really excited about this panel. As I mentioned before, I know each of you individually in different ways. Yiselle, you and I, former colleagues, and we've done so much work together around equity, around DEI work across the industry, both with NOMA and AIA. So it's really exciting to see you, as always, my sister, in championing this important work. Terry, we've worked on a lot of projects here in Chicago. You've partnered with Gensler, working on some of our large community master planning projects on the south and west side of Chicago. So really excited to connect with you today. And Monica, again, our relationship continues to grow. We've had opportunities to serve on multiple panels, but just the work that you've been doing in these communities that we really care about is just really exciting. And so I know that this is going to be an amazing discussion today. I know we're going to burn through this hour very quickly, but really excited to be here. And just wanted to, thank all of you for joining.
Thank you.
So to get us started, we'll just go ahead and we'll dive in. You each engage in issues on environmental equity from different perspectives. And of course, this issue is, as we know, very complex and touches many parts of the work that we all do. Today, we're looking at the built environment and our communities, the models of engagement, the makeup of our firms, our partners that we collaborate with on projects, and how we use research and organizations to help align us with long-term goals on equity and sustainability. So I want to ask three of you, all of you, to tell us what environmental equity means to you and the work that you do. And anyone can start.
I'll start. In that I'm a landscape architect and urban designer, I'd just like to bring up the one maybe distinguishing factor of our type of practice is bringing people to nature. And I think whether it's an intuitive understanding or personal experience. Nature brings us, or having nature around us can relieve stressors in our daily lives, improve mental health, gives us places to exercise. You have the recreation and amusement of seeing like birds and animals, perhaps that go down to the lake in Chicago. And then also there are attributes of, you hear about habitat, meaning like, is the place clean enough that you get these milkweeds and the butterflies come, and then you have the, the migration of butterflies. So some of these things are also like, how clean is our environment? Do we feel comfortable going to the park? Is the air feeling clean? Is the water that we drink clean? So I classify that as nature, but clearly it's like the exterior physical environment and how it affects us.
I love that as a starting point. And Yiselle and I were, when we talked the other day, it's like we were asking that question, like how do you define environment and what does that mean? So what I'd like to add to the definition is sort of that social environment. So not just we've got the natural nature, we've got our physical built environment, but all of those elements that make up the environment that we live in. And that's where I think we'll get into more of this today, but sort of the social environment, the access environment, but just that when we talk environment, because sometimes it's the same with when we talk about sustainability and environment. Sometimes when we're designers, we're kind of very limited in the physical of it. And I think for this conversation, it's just really important to talk about it across multiple lenses.
Well, I'll double down on both those comments. For me, when I think about environmental equity, of course, because I'm an architect and a medical planner, the first thing that comes to mind are the social determinants of health. And the social determinants of health tie social issues, economical issues, access to care, access to health. And what we've learned since research that came out in 2015 is that the social determinants of health, which also include socioeconomical status, which of course aligns with social strata, justice issues, 50% of your health is completely aligned with your zip code of where you live. And where you live has to do with access to nature, access to views, access to air, water, healthcare, food. So when I think about environmental equity, I'm thinking of all the things that make up how we exist in the world. And it is the built environment and the environment and the climate. So it's a pretty complex conversation that could ensue, most certainly. But I think what is interesting is that we are all coming at the conversation through a particular lens, and together it sounds like we start tackling the pieces of why we are so passionate about this topic and why it's so relevant about how we allow people to thrive in the world, as with our responsibilities that we have as designers.
Yeah, I agree. Yiselle, I'm really happy that you brought up that stat. You've shared that with me before, just the statistics and research that's gone into where you live and your zip code being tied to really your life expectancy at the end of the day, your quality of life. And so really for me, it poses a different question around environmental issues, which we know disproportionately impact communities of color, those areas with high poverty levels. So what are some of the issues that you see as critical to both the industry, designers understanding how this happens and how we can shift our approach to tackle these issues?
Listening. I think that's a starting point. Hearing what's going on, understanding what some of the conditions and criteria are. Like, I think building off the comment on health, right? Like when someone comes to you and talks about issues with breathing, access, mental health issues, that we really need to look at, like, what is the place that is making that, and how we as designers are responsible for that. Because if we're not cognizant of light, air, shade, what you see, what's around you, what you smell, what you hear, we can't design for a just environment. And I know I'm being kind of very general when I say that, but we know shade trees are an issue. We know all of these things are issues, but it's like, what are we doing? Like, what are we taking responsibility for, right? We can blame it on city policy. We can blame it on all sorts of things. But when we come to the table as designers, how do we advocate? And I think we advocate by being part of that and not by just being a passive listener or passive in the fact that there is a problem, right? If city policy is the problem, let's get more trees on our sites. If something else is the issue, let's get more natural light into these environments, even though it might be, in a more tunneled physical space or a vacant lot that's between something else, right? Like how do we improve what's there through our role as designers?
Yeah,
like
why
to,
is it so hard for us to listen?
Right. So I just gotta bring up a little quip that for landscape architecture, the first question I usually get is, so what is it that you people do? And that's like a very low bar starting place. And so actually the American Society of Landscape Architects is trying to kind of reframe the question that Monica, you brought up very succinctly. And so if you can imagine a performative design system that gives you shade, gives you public space, helps manage your stormwater, regulates shade, brings you cleaner air and water, and gives you some kind of nature, contact, all within the public spaces or within public projects. And because they're integrated, there's some efficiency so that the cost of actually doing these separate tasks can be combined into something that becomes more resilient over time, and that you have to pay to manage it, but you'd have to pay to manage it anyways. And this way you're kind of building the cost and the need for management into the, if we're going to design A, then we need to, manage A, as opposed to pretending it doesn't need any management. So that is what landscape architects do. We actually build resilient systems, but the way the contracts run, as you were referring to, like policy, it's like, is it an engineering quest? Is it a building quest? Is it a public space need? And by segregating either by contracting funding, as opposed to like, is it performing these things? Like, I think many of us are involved in performance specifications and designs. So just saying that, I think the traditional way of saying, oh, this is landscape architecture. I've actually had someone at a university come to me and say, but we're not doing the tulips yet. So just saying that the comprehension of what you can get out of integrating these things and combining the forces of the architects and engineers and MVP, everybody's systems on site. I think we're within range of, because all of us have had these projects where these things have been successful. So clearly, I guess my answer is just advocating for continuing to do what we've developed, and it's been successful, and to spread that news around so people will ask for it, whether it's the policy people or our co-designers.
I love that. From my lens, because the work that I'm doing right now is really looking at how we become more just, equitable, inclusive people and designers within an organization, to define within a team how we create belonging so that other people can thrive. What I've learned in the last 4 years is that it has to be, for many, a mind shift. Many of us, I studied architecture in Puerto Rico, and for me, the definition of architecture was being a collaborator, an advocate, a co-facilitator. It was really my worldview was in service of the community that I was building. And it was so important for me to recognize the power and the responsibility that I had for people's health, wellness, and safety. And because of where the university that I was in, University of Puerto Rico, the surrounding community had been marginalized for a while, it was very present in our design process that everything we had to do was in mind for how they thrive, not how I want to design, but their needs. And then when I went to school in the US, it was very much about form, and yes, function as a result of form, or vice versa. it was actually a very big struggle for me. And I was sharing that with Monica while we were chatting. It was a big struggle for me to understand and to have to shift my mindset for rethinking of what architecture was for the built environment and for other people. And I've had to decolonize my mind after studying in the United States to what I'm doing right now, to remember what it was for me to think that we design the backdrop of people's lives, how people thrive, how they interact, how they connect, how they access everything. We're responsible for. Each one of us is responsible for doing that. So when I think about what is the biggest shift that I would like my contribution to be in my place in architecture, is changing people's mindsets and conclusions of what it means to be a good designer and what it means to create good architecture and design in a built environment. And when I talk about mindset shift, it's a struggle because people say, well, why is social justice? Why are you talking about social issues? Let's just talk about design and architecture. And architecture is rooted on social constructs. It is a representation of culture. So how do you start talking about mindset shift, paradigm shifts? And for me, it goes beyond just designing. And part of the things that I'm doing right now is digging deep into the culture of an organization and meeting with clients, meeting them where they are and asking them, what is your mindset now? How are your goals aligning with the outcome that you have for your project and that we have, co-creating with you those KPIs for the project? And many don't know how to wrap their heads around it. So we have to talk about what it's a monocultural mindset, an intercultural mindset, and how do we create a culture shift around a mindset shift? And that's complicated, but I'm curious about it.
Please, Monica, I was going to comment, but I was going to talk about just the challenges within our education process and that shift. I've never heard it kind of discussed that way. I'm thinking about my own education and how I really benefited going to grad school where everything was a group project. I thought that really helped prepare me coming into the industry, whereas everything in undergrad was a solo design project, a studio project. But being part of teams, having to do everything in collaboration with the team was one of those things that I think I really benefited from coming out of school. But I think that there are definitely shifts that we need to discuss in terms of how we approach the work, how we train the next generation of architects who are very passionate about this work. You know, the next generation, the young talent that's coming out, they are less focused about the big names and designing skyscrapers. They want to have an impact on their community. They want to leave the world better than the way they found it. And so you see this in their mission. They're definitely mission focused, but it really comes back to a quote that one of my partners, Gensler often says, Andre Brumfield, Terry, you know Andre well. Yep. He always says that we have our contractual client and we have our spiritual client, and you have to serve both. And it's important that architects understand that spiritual client, this is the community, these are the stakeholders, these are the people that are going to own and inhabit the projects and the buildings that we design. It's those people that don't have a voice and have been neglected and or ignored in the process. And so, Monica, I know you were about to say something here shortly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. So kind of two sides of that. So one, I wanted to just pick up like the co-create and in service, right? Like we're a profession that is in service, right? And I really honestly think we've been forgetting that at a sort of uber pie in the sky level, right? Like there's a moment where it becomes about the design, the look, the awards, the this, the that, and it's like we are a profession that is in service. And when we talk about both the education and then how we serve when we're working there, I think right now there's a disconnect, right? That there's a disconnect between like, I as a student have autonomy and authorship over the design, whether it's in a team or as a solo student. And then there's the reality, right? You're out in the environment and you're like, you can't make decisions in a silo. You can't be individual about these processes. And like I agree with what you're saying about sort of client and spiritual client, but I think it's more than that. I actually think our client is everything that you're describing. So if I'm working with a nonprofit, working on something like a community center or other, it's like there may be the nonprofit client, but really it's like everyone who is going to use and pass through and be served by this building is who my client is. and you know, who's footing the bill to me is like a secondary element to like who we are serving. We're serving the community in the where we're working, and that community are all of that community is stakeholders in the project, and all should have a voice in this process.
Yeah,
So-
we have a slightly different attribute in design in that we actually can't control every attribute. And but however, if you give the context wrong, your whole project dies, and everyone can see that. So it's kind of sad. But there are equivalents where, you know, just saying, I think landscape architecture follows architecture in terms of like development of the professional education and acknowledgement of like the fame and, you know, the design look and all these things. And so even though we are literally rooted in the site and the weather and the, you know, things around that you can't control once the project's constructed, there is still this being enamored with this idea of the all-powerful architect who's dictating, you know, every attribute, and very different than, as you are all bringing up, this community service at, you know, incentive towards design. And I think in particular, I think all of us have had projects where we are in the community of underserved folks, and not everyone's interested in, you know, that side of design practice, but you know, I'm almost like to hear from you all some of the aspects, because I think that is part of the education, is once you get in touch and actually found out the richness or the fact that you're affecting something really important as a student, sometimes you get hooked on really wanting to serve.
Yeah, I know it really, I think, kind of shaped my career path, Terry. I'll tell you, just being both an architect and urban designer. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm really passionate about, you know, serving underserved, marginalized communities. And I don't care if it's a data center or a community center, if there's something that's going to be positive for a community and there's a community engagement component that's deeply tied to it, then I want to be a part of it. I've moved away from typologies per se, you know, and it's more about the process and the community that I'm touching. And so I guess my question then for the group is, you know, knowing that there's this focus and that there's this need to ensure that the community is part of the process, how do we go about ensuring that they are at the table, that they do have a seat, right? And you even said something the other day, Terry, when we were kind of going back and forth. It's not only just having a seat, or you said something along the lines of, well, I finally have a seat at the table, but you're serving me water. And that is like stuck with me in terms of, you know, am I really able to, you know, to participate and be there and be nourished and also kind of share in this process once I get there? Or is it just, you know, am I being ignored in the process? So how do we go about doing that? What are some of the best practices around this that you all have seen to help ensure that everyone's voice is heard in the conversation?
Well, I can share really quickly because I'm working on a project right now. It's a TOD project. And what I've heard from the client and from some of the collaborators that we're working with, and Gail and you in studio, is that providing choice for people to engage however feels the most comfortable for them. So we're looking at digital tools, we're looking at pop-ups, we're looking at doing tours. Like if it's a TOD, do we get in the bus and ride with them for a while? But something that's really interesting, so what I'm going to say is going beyond the town hall. Because most of us always say, well, we're having a one town hall and we shared it with the community and that's fine. Where's the feedback loop? Where are the people that can't engage with through a town hall? So you need to provide multiple layers of access for people to connect with, provide you feedback, and also consider what a feedback loop will look like. Because you can't just ask one question and with that one answer define an entire project. Like you need multiple perspectives, multiple answers, and a feedback loop. But something that we're doing that I'm very excited about is we were looking at defining personas, which we do in many projects. We do that in healthcare, we do that in education. We create varying personas, and especially when we don't have access to community stakeholders and we don't have access to churches or community centers, Well, we create sort of these personas, and we look at demographic data, we look at GIS, and we look at ESRI data, and we start to define different types of people. Race, gender, age, ability, like all of these things, access, whether they care about the system or they don't care about the system. And with this project, well, we've asked the client, we don't know exactly if we're going to be able to do that or not, but we've asked the client to find embodiments of these personas. So we are not only saying, oh, we can pretend, because right, adjacency to an experience is not the experience. What we want to say is, no, find us people that are as close to that experience in their life to these personas that we're creating, and let's follow them using wearables or different things. How we quantify that data, we're not even going to get to that, but we're trying to get as close as possible to the experience of a multitude variety of people, create intersectionality in those, and then try to study that data through their lens. So even with Google wearables and like iPhones and iPads and some wearables, what is the closest proximity that we have to gather data that would allow us to interpret the world through other experiences that are not our own? So it's, for me, it's about choice, and JEDI and EDI, DEI, and all of these things are about a process. And for me, the process are about choices. So how do we incorporate the greatest amount of opportunity for people to share what their choices are and how they would go about those choices?
Well, and I love what you're saying about, I think that's really critical, because both the feedback loop and multiple layers. So we talk about that all the time in our work. And when we present kind of our processes, we're like, not everyone's going to show up at an open forum. Not everyone's going to be at a farmer's market. Not everyone's going to be online. I mean, literally the digital divide becomes a conversation, right? Yep. Can I physically get to where it is? Do I have a babysitter? Like all of these criteria. So I 100% agree. The multiple layers win, the multiple layers to access information, multiple ways to participate. And then how do you incorporate that? So we often start like right at the rooted of like, not just dreams and desires, but like, you know, how is open space important to you if we're working on an outdoor program, or, you know, what is, you know, like, when you do this, what does it feel like? What does it look like? What is it like? So we're not trying to like design in that moment. We're actually trying to hear, and we're trying to hear the qualities and criteria that then we, with our professional lenses, can start to interpret that. So if we understand, like I want to see outside, I love the feel of the sun, I love a quiet place to read a book. We as designers can start to iterate what the physical space of that might look like, but we're not the ones who can describe the quality of the space in the communities we're working in, right? We that is where we're in service. And I want to add one thing is, I think transparency of the process is the other layer. So we try to, as we develop, like when we're putting together proposals, we have a project in Milwaukee where we're like, we're going to have 3 touch points at minimum. Like one touch point might be multiple markets, but like we want to understand at the beginning, we want to reflect, we want the feedback loop. It's like, here's what we heard, here's kind of what we envision from what we heard, have that feedback loop. And then maybe you then on a 3rd or possibly a 4th, you're like, okay, this is the reflection of, and you're still taking that feedback, right? Design is never done. There's a moment where you have to stop, but it's never done.
Especially with some of us, right?
Yeah.
But that transparency piece that you're talking about, Monica, I think you're right. I think transparency with the community, right? Ensuring that they are truly part of the process, that they can see their fingerprints and their ownership in the design, right? And that's how you have successful projects. And the other piece is sometimes, you know, you're coming in and you're also repairing damage from, you know, previous teams or previous projects that have taken place. You know, in some cases, you have communities that have been surveyed to death and they haven't seen anything come out of this. They haven't seen any action, any development. They've been, you know, sold or told, false promises and things that never came to fruition. And so you have to really work hard to, I think, regain that trust with them. And you do it by being honest and transparent within the process.
I'd like to add another attribute, which is aside from the professional work that we all do and we need to keep food on the table, I've had experiences as a volunteer in a community, and I haven't really read through any guidebooks as to, you know, at what point are you like transparent? Are you, so just to explain, like my family's originally from Boston, and I have ties to the Boston Chinatown community, which in the 1960s, the FHWA came through, put a highway through, and like smashed, you know, divided the community, which is the same thing that happened outside of Tampa, outside of Stockton, California. So this is not something, it's not specific to Asian, it's like throughout the United States, Black community, same MO, if you would. And there is historical, what do you say? It's like trauma. And there is, you know, and so even though we are many generations behind, my parents were activists and they were kind of working to empower the local community that didn't have a voice. Even, you know, this is like 60, 70 years later, there's a distrust for planners who come in and reticence to maybe engage with design teams, even though truthfully, the outcomes are rich and better. But there is sort of this local, like they want to have someone local that they kind of know of. And so it's just been an interesting perspective. But the work I do there, I don't get paid for. I just kind of come in and able to share like a professional viewpoint to help get people over the bumps. We certainly, in our professional world, can't be in every neighborhood that would actually not be truthful, you know, all the places that we're called to do design work. But I just thought I'd bring it up because if we have, let's say, new designer listeners in on this call, I don't think it's a negative to be part of your community and actually know people. I've had other folks, because I was doing this historic preservation work, and there's this gentleman who's in charge of historic preservation in the island of Guam, and he says, why would you like do business with anyone that you've never had a meal with? And I thought, well, this is sort of like a language I understand, but I never even thought about it. So there are many levels of, you know, educating in two directions. And, you know, this is not, let's say, the professional level that we all practice at, but there is some idea of service, or, you know, working towards a common good that may be something that will come up in a young person's career, and then they can consider this as like they're in a neighborhood, maybe they could be helpful, but not to exclude themselves and say, well, I can't, because when I was coming up through the design profession, we did look at that like, oh, we can't do that, that's not professional. But I think things are more of a conversation now, things are more possible because people are having deeper, richer conversations about like my racial background. Like when I started working, you know, I'm the same person I was then, but my work did not reflect anything that, you know, it was supposed to be kind of vanilla, excellent, it met all the needs. But, and Jason, I don't know if that was the same thing, or you're Monica, Yiselle, if you like your racial identity was sort of like put in the back seat, if not seen at all, actually, in order for you to be successful.
Right. And that actually, you know, that's actually a really good segue to the question that I was going to pose to both you and Monica. You know, the two of you, you have your own practice, Terry within landscape design, Monica architecture design. You're both doing very well, thriving here in Chicago. But, you know, I'm curious about some of the challenges that you have faced, challenges and opportunities that you have faced, especially in this moment with the racial awakening that has happened across the country following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, and now this renewed focus around MBEs and WBEs right across our practice areas and industry. Just how your experience, the two of you, how your experience has been running your own firm, being founders of your own design practice.
Wow, so many things you could say. I think what's been really fascinating. So for me, there's like probably like three versions of that, or like my joke right now is like when we sign contracts, I can be an MB or a WB, right? I can't be both for a project.
Yeah.
And just the fact that that's data, right? Like that's how we sign contracts, to me is just there's just something wrong. But on the broader note, it's like what I'm finding, which is new, which I hadn't anticipated, and this is coming more from founder principal side, is it's not just client expectations or when you walk on site with a contractor, when you do things like that, but it's actually all your relationships, even in terms of staff, peers, colleagues at a different level. So something I want to bring to the table because it's newer to me, but it's like, is how you in a position of leadership talk to different because you're female versus male. And we sometimes talk about that. It's like, if your boss was an elder white male versus if your boss was a minority female, how would you interact with them, both from the top side and not just from client or contractor or other people? And Terry, I'm kind of curious, like that's a newer facet to me. And then I'm going to throw motherhood into this equation too, because you want to talk about female or minority or anything. Try like being the person who, like, you have a student who's in grad school saying, you know, you're the first person who has kids I've ever met in a profession. So just, there's so many facets to it. It's just, it's not one thing.
Yeah, I gave a talk at U of I last year, and you know, you just don't process things until you actually get called to say things that you maybe just never really thought about. So I actually wanted to, you know, bring up all the kind of my mentors, and at which point I realized they were all white males, right? And thank them for not distinguishing between me and another type of student, perhaps. But this is for all of us, I guess, because historically, you know, the white men situation of how the economic society had been built in the prior generations. So we may find out that, you know, all of our precedents are the folks that people are aiming their negative thoughts towards. But you know, so it's very complicated. I don't believe, because my work is somewhat science-based as well, as opposed to just socially or financially based. I'm working with a lot of data just in terms of producing design. So in some ways I'm like, I don't think that, you know, a white male is providing me a different version of scientific data because it's supposedly science. But I just wanted to bring that up because I've always thought that was sort of a weird quizzical thing. I would say, though, that at this point in time, the table has turned more than like tenfold in a good way. And even Jason brought up like George Floyd, and shortly thereafter, there was the murder of the Asian women in Georgia. And people actually came out to me and like, how are you doing? How are you feeling about it? And it was sort of actually a emotional turning point for me as a practitioner, because I was actually not allowed to bring, you know, we all look as we do, they understand that we come from different backgrounds, but it was never part of my conversation that I came out and actually said, because there was no space for it, frankly. But when I was asked, let's say earlier by the certification departments from city agencies, have you experienced racism? And, you know, I went to graduate school. I had parents who were educated. I could not point to saying, you know, a definitive yes, and this is when it happened. We all have issues with contractors and trailers, and I would deny that that was racism. I just thought it was like a contract situation. But at that point of, you know, George Floyd, and that the door opens, then I actually, you know, in my head said, I would call it structural racism. But is it that we're such a small company that we produce small amounts of work, and therefore it's hard to compete with our high overhead because they're small? Or is it that we're not really part of the old boy network in Chicago? And I don't, you know, I like to go with, well, we'll just try harder, and we'll, you know, and we have the notoriety, we have the design proof, but every project is a struggle to get like the next commission. And, you know, we've been fortunate, we've had some projects with Gensler, and you always think, oh, it's got to be easier, they're such a big company. But I don't know if that's true. You know, I think in the time that we are awake, we only know how to answer so many questions. So, but I would just say that compared to, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, we can talk about race, and we can bring up the issues that we hear from neighborhoods that are maybe not our own color. But I feel like I can speak for folks. At one point I was at the Forest Preserve and I brought up this thing about, like, you know, I don't know how long it is before we're going to see a Native American person on this council that I was sitting on, because, you know, I was on a federal council and those guys just got the vote a year ago. And what's that about? I mean, we're in this country that we are embracing equity, yet there just seem to be these weird lazy barriers to actually allowing people votes and voices. So that's enough.
Yeah.
I hope.
Well, no, I mean, I just think it's fascinating. I know that just inherently some of the challenges that, you know, you and Monica and other, you know, small MBE, WBE firms actually face, both prior to 2020, you know, and now. Yiselle, you know, coming back to you, you're dealing with a whole different set of challenges because you are trying to, both you and I are in the same kind of position as global directors of a DEI for our companies, really trying to help shift or pivot the entire ship, right? To get our leadership, you know, across the board, across our offices, our regions, all the way down to studio leads on board, to get them to understand why this is important, to understand the difference between equality and equity, which is often conflated. And so, you know, I would love to hear just some of the challenges that you've been facing over the course of your career, and primarily the last 4 or 5 years, where you've really like dug your heels into this work in ways that is just are admirable and really need to be applauded and championed. So thank you.
Well, thank you for taking that mantle too. Join the bandwagon. No, I appreciate that. And I know our journey started pretty much, we started talking about things like this in, what was it, 2008?
Long time ago.
Diversity champions and caring about this work. I think for me, it goes back to awareness. It goes back to awareness, mindset, the choices we make, and how we when we ask ourselves, what are the choices that we're making? Who are we making the choices for and with? So I love to tie the conversation with initiatives that we have right now around how do we create a stronger network with XBEs, which Monica is likely going to help us with. But it's really about what you are able to bring to the table with your agency. So I've tried my best to build psychological safety around myself and hope that other leaders mirror that as well. So I tend to challenge a lot, but I welcome the challenge as well. I've grown into my voice in the last 3 years and also lost a tooth, but it's totally fine. And I think the challenges have been in reminding people that the conclusions that they have lived with are very much a set of patterns that are based in their cultural upbringing. That does have to do with your race, your gender, the geography, religious affiliation, sexual orientation. Like, it has to do with so many things, and those things layer on top of each other, and that those conclusions are based on just the space that you've existed in. And in order for you to truly be representative of a community, so that the work that you're doing is very reflective of not only the people that are experiencing the space, but the potential of all the people that are experiencing that for however many years your intervention has in this world, it needs to consider more than just what you know right now. And in 100%. Doing that, it's a tough conversation, because you're sort of confronting a person and telling them what you've known all your life and what you know right now is looking wildly different than my experience. So I need to get to know you really well, and you need to get to know me really well, just so that we can have a complex conversation. Because in our commonalities and our differences is where richness happens. And that's where we are actually doing our best. So you have to kind of move away from everything that you know as a set version of conclusions, and then seeking out the evidence to confirm your conclusions, so that you can understand my behavior and I can understand yours. Because when we talk about behaviors, and I know Monica and you chatted about that, when we talk about behaviors, many times in many organizations, from data, in business and MBAs, and even in change management, what we talk about is behavior change. So how do you manage behavior change? It's this carrot or the stick. We celebrate the people that are doing the great things, and we penalize the people that are doing the wrong things. Do we ask why? So why are we celebrating this? Why are these people doing the things that we value? And why are these other people not doing it? And the answer I usually get is, well, that's really hard. I'm like, well, yeah. If I wouldn't have a job if it weren't hard. It's really hard. And it's really hard because we're creatures of comfort. And these are things that were ingrained even from the eons of time. We seek things out for our safety, emotional, physical, all of those things. And the recognition that all of us seek out safety, legal issues differently is something that we don't talk about. Yeah. So I have to start really slow with this is just where we are right now, and have to talk about descriptions, being very clear about, let's describe issues, let's intentionally evaluate them, let's understand how we are interpreting these things, because what we're saying right now is a direct outcome in our design. Yeah. Designs are perfectly outcomes are rooted in the design process. So what you're getting is what you're designing for. So if you're not getting what you want, it's on you. It's on each one of us to understand our place in the problem or the solution. So it's been a challenge to have conversations like this constantly. Yeah. But I can't imagine another way of doing it. Right.
Right. And the fatigue that's kind of built in. Yeah, but I know you're going to.
Yeah, the built up. Yeah, no, I just want to build on it, because one thing we've found, because, you can look at me and say, okay, that's an Indian woman who's a professional, right? Like, but when we engage, when we start these conversations, when we're working with stakeholders and clients, we sometimes will break it all the way down as like, what's your community, or what community are you from? Like, not what neighborhood you're from, not what is your profession, but community, because like, I am a female. I am also a minority. I am also a city person. I am also a mom. But like, in terms of breaking down these barriers, right? Like, I may be talking to someone who's not the same color as me, or not the same profession as me, or not live in the same neighborhood as me, but we both share something, right? Whether it's an ethnic identity, whether it's a gender identity, whether it's a familial relationship, but that we're finding, like, we do have common communities, despite all the differences we're talking about and all the challenges you're talking about. I bet we can find something that we share, a community relationship that maybe sometimes can help start that conversation, or make it feel like we're coming from a similar place. So it's just like, I think that is so important to understand. While we may not live where you live, we may be of a community that we can empathize or support or design for or understand.
Yeah. And when you eliminate those barriers, I mean, you're helping to build empathy and understanding, right? I mean, and that's just a critical piece that's required. I think that's in the formula for it to be successful. I know, as promised, I knew we were going to burn through this hour, and there's a lot that we can. We only made it through, I think, like half of the questions that we had initially scripted, but I do want to try to find some time to take it back to our audience who has started to generate some questions for us. There's a couple that I've seen that have popped up. One was, what are some actionable steps that we can inform our non-minority people of color colleagues and peers to show up and advocate for racial justice and equity in our work, at home, etc.?
Not being passive, like not ignoring the fact that it exists. Being an Asian minority, I find that I'm often identified as not the minority, right? It's people talk about model minority as a stereotype, or I've had a dear friend say, well, I think of you as white, right? Like, and in this environment, that may seem strange to say, but these are genuine responses from people genuinely trying to understand. So if we could just start by acknowledging and understanding, it's like, I want to support you, but I understand I'm coming from a different perspective, or asking, how can I support you? Right? Like what is it that you need? Just starting very basically, if there's an awareness, then ask. Don't try to problem solve, right? Ask. So anyway.
Yeah, I've always thought that we have, I mean, everyone on this panel is a person of color, right? So I've always had a sense that we have a opportunity because of our position of professional, you know, we've probably digested a lot more of the, you know, attributes of the racial question, in part because just becoming a professional and working to see what works so that we can become leaders or, you know, help the situation. But I think there's a component of inviting people to the conversation and inviting people to take action that, let's say, if I'm at one polar end of the conversation, maybe I'm sympathetic, but I don't feel like maybe it's not my place. Or, you know, how are people going to receive me if I'm in the, let's say I'm a white majority person. But I'm heard this before, and I'm also of the firm belief that it's an everybody together solving the issue situation.
Yeah.
So we're not going to have, let's say, Black people talk about Black things and people only concerned about Asian issues, or Latino. Same. It's more like everybody's got to be supporting each other. Even in fact, like the BIPOC minority folks supporting white injustice, if you see that, because it affects us. And we've all heard this, but that's sort of where I sit as well. I think that we all need to watch each other's back and be active, as Monica said. You have to speak up and be part of the process.
For me, the easier thing, or the thing that I'd remind myself of quite often, is the platinum rule. Just treat people how they want to be treated. Which means you have to get to know them, you have to listen, you have to be engaged, and you have to be intentional in what you say, what you do, because intent and impact are two very different things.
Yeah.
You can have wonderful intentions, but your impact can be very different than what you intend. So listen, ask questions, and make sure that you're doing what is best for them because of what they need and what they want. So treat people how they want to be treated.
So I know we're closing out the hour. We have a few minutes left. Actually, I want to close it with one more question for each of you, and it's, what brings you meaning today, and what are you optimistic about, both in the industry and the profession?
This call.
I mean, I know you're excited to be on the call with me, Yiselle. I get it. But aside from that, and our touch points, what are you excited about, optimistic about? What brings you meaning?
It's that these conversations are starting to happen more regularly.
Yeah.
That we are able to speak honestly, freely, and candidly about where we are, where we've been, and we want to get to. And we continue to build our village. Like Jason, you've been part of my village for a very long time, over a decade. And now Monica and Terry are part of my village. And building this network and continuing to remind ourselves, and particularly myself, that I'm not alone in this process, that there are a lot of people that care, that value this, that we're, as Terry said, that it takes all of us and each of us connecting to do this. It fills my soul. It fills my soul. So thank you, Jason, for the invitation. And I'm incredibly grateful to be here and to get to know Terry and Monica even better.
Yes, I'd like to also thank Jason for remembering, having worked on projects together and now having a chance to put our brains together. I guess I'm naturally optimistic anyways, but years ago, I would use the word ecology and it could just be this blank glaze. I've had clients walk out of the room saying, "Oh, they're going to speak Latin now." And I think there's a community awareness and engagement and a desire request to have this kind of nature healthy environment. And likewise with just the discussion that we're having today, this is a very different discussion that I would never have imagined it a number of years ago. And I just want to bring that up to the younger listeners who sometimes you think things aren't happening fast enough. I've seen a sea change of priorities across the whole design profession of all sorts of, designer, large, small firms, AE, really wanting to engage with me as an individual as well. And that also, that didn't happen initially. So I'm thinking that we are moving, maybe not as fast as you'd like this freighter ship to move, but I think that it is much more positive, and I think the outcomes are just greater as they go. I'm very encouraged.
I love to hear that. I'm optimistic and passionate about so many things. As you know me, the glass is half full when it comes to this kind of conversation. I'm so excited. I think there's two things. Is in terms of optimism and passion, it's people, right? Like that's what gets me out of bed in the morning is working with people, being around people, connecting the dots, conversations like this, and the optimism. And we talk about youth and we talk about next generation and the optimism, but we did an outreach at a farmer's market for one of our clients, for a museum client, around education. And one of the people literally wrote on the card, "Children are the leaders of today." And I think that was a really telling statement. And I almost feel like my optimism, like what am I looking forward to in the future? Is like, if we designed with the attitude that children are the leaders of today, I think a lot of us would work differently, would design differently.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you so much. Just so excited again to be on the panel with you all today. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules. And with that, I think we will close out today's panel.